Hello, good morning, and happy belated Earth Day to everyone. Thank you to all the participants for joining us today. On behalf of everyone here at SES Consulting Services, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm your host, Bonnie Holman, SES Consulting Services Managing Director. So before I introduce our topic and my co-presenter for today's webinar, I'd like to take a moment to update all of our listeners on our event platform, GoToWebinar, and how to engage with the speakers. To avoid any unnecessary background noises during the presentation, all attendees have been muted and will remain in a one-way presentation for the duration of the event. This is going to be a tight presentation today. We have a lot of information for you to cram into the 45 minutes we have. However, if you would like to ask a question to myself or my co-presenter, please utilize the question section in the control panel on your upper right-hand side of your webinar console. Once you type your question and hit send, your question will be sent to the panel for review. Actually, what we will be doing with today's webinar is we will be responding to questions directly after the presentation. Today's presentation recording will be sent to all registrants and attendees after the conclusion of the webinar, and that typically is sent out 1 to 2 days after today's event. Great. So on behalf of everyone, I would like to get us started on the presentation. I'm excited to introduce my co-presenter, Eric Olson. Eric Olson is our Senior Technical Manager in Climate Services here at SES Consulting Services. And we are going to go ahead and get started. So just a quick disclaimer here, this webinar is informational only, and we are not providing any legal or financial advice during the course of today's webinar. Additionally, the webinar is not intended to take the place of any research or advisory support towards specific decision-making around your company. So just a little bit about SES Consulting Services. We were launched in 2021 as a dedicated consulting advisory business to operate alongside our sister company, SES Global Services. Grown out of SES Global Services collective deep expertise in impact-driven market solutions, SES Consulting Services aims to serve as a partner throughout our client's sustainability journey, supporting to create and achieve sustainability goals in a rapidly changing climate and business environment. This slide provides a summary of our core services, a main category of which is climate services, which we will be covering the SEC role in many of the topics here: carbon footprint, climate risk assessment, climate scenario analysis, decarbonization or transition plans are covered in today's topic. So I mentioned SES Global Services previously. SES as a brand today holds 4 institutions. So this is just a quick slide to educate our participants a little bit about our organizational growth. SES Global Services is celebrating 40 years this year, and SES Consulting Services and SES Standards are newer arms of the SES brand, and the Global Heat Reduction Initiative is in its formation. So the 4 main themes that we're going to cover in today's webinar are essentially aspects of the new SEC rule, what companies the rule applies to, and what that compliance timeline looks like. We'll spend quite a bit of time going into the new requirements, and we'll look at some next steps as well. So on March 6th, 2024, after a lengthy 2-year period, the SEC announced the final climate disclosure rule. Upon the issuance of the rule, the SEC chair, Gary Gensler, stated that the goal of the rule is to essentially enable consistent, comparable, and decision-useful information for making investment decisions. In fact, this rule is the culmination of investor-centered efforts going back over 15 years. So going back to 2010, the SEC issued its first interpretive guidance indicating how existing disclosure rules may require the disclosure of impacts of climate change on the business if financially material. In 2015, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, otherwise known as TCFD, was formed with the purpose to increase reporting and improve its consistency and comparability across all global markets. And they did that through the development of the voluntary TCFD framework and guidance, the first version of which was published in 2017. And the TCFD voluntary framework has been widely used globally by companies seeking to provide investor-grade data to shareholders. In 2021, the G7 countries agreed to move forward with development of regulations within each of their respective jurisdictions. This decision essentially enabled the formation that same year of the International Sustainability Standards Board, otherwise known as ISSB, which was charged with formalizing the voluntary TCFD framework into a global standard that has, and it's worth noting that ISSB has also taken over the oversight role that was formerly held by the task force. This is important background just to understand that the SEC rule has been proposed and finalized alongside our G7 peers, with an increasing number of G20 jurisdictions proposing and finalizing similar rules. So back to the SEC, in March of 2022, the proposed rule, the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures for investors, was released to the public. Through a very deliberate 2-year process that included multiple public comment periods, the Commission received and processed over 24,000 comment letters. The finalization of the rule has marked some narrowing from some of the components that were in the proposed rule, and we're going to go over, what is really in that final rule today. On March 6th, the final rule was issued. A coalition of attorney generals from 10 states filed a lawsuit to challenge the rule shortly after its issuance. And on April 4th of this year, earlier this month, the Commission stayed the rule until it clears judicial review. So as with prior SEC rules that have been litigated and stayed, it's just important to note that a stay does not necessarily mean that adjudication will delay the compliance dates. So that is to say that affected companies should prepare to comply while tracking to the forthcoming legal decision. So let's take a look at those compliance dates. This is a table that just kind of lays out what is a waterfall compliance timeline that is applied to different sizes of registrants, starting with large accelerated filers, then accelerated filers, and then the final category, non-accelerated filers, small reporting companies, and emerging growth companies. All the disclosures that you see kind of presented on this timeline must be included in the annual 10K, except I could say material scope 1 and 2 emission disclosures may be disclosed in Q2, 10Q, or 20F for foreign companies. The compliance timeline starts next year for large accelerated filers. There's about 2,500 companies that fit under this category. And the compliance timeline starts with reporting on climate-related risks, governance, targets, and other supplementary information, with financial reporting on material expenditures and impacts occurring a year later. Material scope 1 and 2 emissions starting that same year, and limited assurance, which is essentially the non-financial auditing assurance process starting in fiscal year 2029. You will note that the category for non-accelerated filers, small reporting companies, and emerging growth companies have less requirements. So reporting on material scope 1 and 2 emissions is not required for this category, and there is no assurance requirement for this category as well. Okay, so based on the compliance timeline that we just showed, we just want to take a quick poll and ask our participants, when does compliance start for your company? So the options are fiscal year 2025, filed in 2026. That's for the large accelerated filers. Next category, fiscal year 2026, filed in 2027. It's for the accelerated filers. Fiscal year 2028, filing in 2029. There's a little bit of a typo there on the screen. That's for the NAFs, SRCs, and EGCs. And then, of course, if it doesn't apply to you or you're just not sure, you can click that fourth option. And we'll just give a few more seconds to allow folks to vote. Okay, and I think we can go ahead and close voting. So the majority of our participants are not sure the rule does not apply to us. Well, for those of you, if the SEC rule does not apply to you, it's certainly still worth tracking. And it's worth noting that quite a bit of the content within the SEC rule does align to some other regulations and even voluntary reporting on climate-related risks. So worth checking into this. And then great to see 14% are required to begin in fiscal year 2025. For that group, the take-home message is, get started now, and you might have already gotten started. So now let's shift over to talking about what is in the rule, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Eric Olson.
Great. Thanks, Bonnie, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar. As Bonnie kind of discussed just a minute ago, the final rule has disclosure requirements that will be included in SEC Regulation SX for financial statement metrics, as well as SEC Regulation SK for non-financial statement disclosures. The area which the registrant files the disclosure will indicate the methods of audit and organizational control required. And as implied, the content of the disclosure differs significantly, as non-financial statement disclosures are primarily qualitative, while the SX financial statement disclosures are financial metrics. The rule has several requirements that will need to be disclosed within financial statements. A registrant will be required to disclose financial data related to the impacts of severe weather events and other natural conditions, as well as financial data related to RECs or carbon offsets, if either of those are a material component of a described greenhouse gas reduction target or plan. The Commission does provide a de minimis thresholds for each disclosure item. The registrant will be required to separately aggregate expenditures and losses, as well as aggregating costs and charges to apply the threshold. For expenditures and losses, impacts are subject to the threshold of greater than 1% of absolute value of a registrant's pre-tax income, or potentially loss, or a value of $100,000. It's related to costs and charges. Impacts are subject to the threshold if it's greater than 1% of the absolute value of the stockholder's equity or amount of $500,000. As common throughout the rule, the commission is not exhaustive in defining what consists of a severe weather event or other natural conditions. The commission also does not define what a material component of a disclosed target plan or transition plan is. So for many organizations, the first step might be to make those definitions and define things like severe weather events and other natural conditions that will allow your organization to be better able to collect and aggregating that impact data that will be needed to be disclosed within the financial statements. The backbone of the non-financial statement disclosure requirements follow the recommendations presented in TCFD, which a lot of organizations are familiar with. In the SEC comments to the final rule, the commission was clear with their intention to use a familiar reporting scheme and generate decision useful metrics. The significant components are identified. Material climate-related risks, assessing the impacts of climate-related risks on business strategy and model, defining the processes and managing and adapting to climate-related risks, disclosure of metrics used to quantify climate-related risk, and the disclosure of the governance and management systems established to oversee climate-related risk. The SEC climate rule does differ from TCFD in several significant components. One aspect is that the SEC does not require the disclosure of any information related to opportunities. It only focuses on climate-related risk. Disclosures related to opportunities may be included, but are optional. Another key component of the final rule, and a significant change from the 2022 proposed rule, is the application of financial materiality throughout this section. The commission's choosing to require registrants to apply traditional financial materiality determination as defined by the Supreme Court. And in doing so, the commission specifically states that that determination is fact-based and may require both quantitative and qualitative considerations when determining what is financially material. This is a significant departure from the proposed rule and one that will require registrants to thoroughly extend their financial materiality determination process to climate-related risk items. Within the non-financial disclosures, financial materiality is explicitly applied throughout this rule. We see it applied in risk identification, risk impacts on business and strategy. If you use scenario analysis, whether or not it's material, also looking at things like transition plans, targets and goals, and then specifically to your scope 1 and 2 emissions, all those have a materiality determination applied to them. As we will see when we look through the rule, some of the materiality determinations will cascade through the disclosure, while other determinations stand alone. In practice, organizations will need to complete an extensive climate-related risk analysis prior to determining what aspects are material and need to be disclosed. Our process for climate risk analysis begins with identifying the client's existing risk management systems and reviewing if any climate and all climate-related risks are specifically being evaluated. The SEC defines climate-related risks as the actual or potential negative impacts of climate-related conditions and events on a registrant's business, results of its operations, or financial conditions. As described in the SEC and TCFD, the registrant is required to disclose physical risks, which are environmental events such as floods, fires, droughts, and transition risks, which are risks related to the transition to a lower carbon economy separately. So you need to have your physical risks disclosed as well as your transition risks disclosed. Our process starts by casting a wide net in an attempt to identify all the potential climate-related risks an organization may be reasonably exposed to. Related to physical climate-related risks include acute risk as well as chronic risk to the registrant's business operations. An organization should evaluate the geographic location of the risk, whether it is an acute or chronic risk, and which assets, processes, operations are at risk. Transition risk is defined as the actual or potential negative impacts on the registrant's business, results of operations, or financial conditions as related to the transition to a low carbon economy. And an organization should evaluate market risk, technological risk, regulatory risk, and other potential risks that are specific to their industry. A deviation from the proposed rule is how the SEC is including the registrant's value chain in the required disclosure. In the proposed rule, the Commission specifically required registrants to evaluate physical and transition risks to their value chain. This requirement's been eliminated as part of a lot of removing specific aspects to value chain and scope 3. However, within the rule, the SEC does say that if a physical or transition risk in the organization's value chain is reasonably likely to materially impact its business and or the results of its operation, then that value chain risk will need to be identified. So it's basically saying that you don't need to call out your value chain risk, but you still need to evaluate them if they meet that materiality threshold. Again, it leads back to the materiality threshold. Another important aspect within your risk analysis process is establishing clear time horizons for assessing those risks. Some risks obviously have more impact in the near term, while other risks have a longer term impact, and that will affect how an organization chooses to adapt and manage those risks. For each of the climate-related risks identified, an organization will assess that risk on the business, including but not limited to impacts on operation, products, supply chain, and compliance. The organization will also consider how a climate-related risk may affect the strategy, financial planning, and capital allocation of the business. In doing so, the organization may choose to use scenario analysis to assess the business or a singular aspect of the business in relation to a climate-related risk. The outcome of that scenario analysis may inform and potentially help develop long-term business strategy. Throughout this assessment process, the organization will then prioritize which climate-related risks are most impactful and which risks may meet that financial materiality threshold. Significantly important throughout all this process is to clearly identify and document the processes for which you're followed in your risk identification and risk management process. There is a possibility that an organization could do an extensive climate-related risk analysis and determine that no climate-related risks meet the materiality threshold. And in that case, they wouldn't have to disclose anything as it relates to climate-related risk. However, again, it would be in the organization's best interest to have very clear documentation to the risk analysis, assessment, and management process followed to make that determination. And like other risk analysis, it's equally important to continue to monitor for climate-related risks over time as those impacts may change, both on a physical risk and transition risk assessment. So we've gone through the risk analysis process and we've identified the climate-related risks being prioritized. The organization will then want to establish a strategy for responding and managing to each of the climate-related risks and determine which metrics are most useful for the organization to monitor their response. Within this aspect, the organizations may choose to use things like climate transition plans and or internal prices of carbon to manage those specific climate risks. And each of these aspects, if they're material within within the risk management process may need to be disclosed within the non-financial disclosure area. So as we revisit this slide, we can see how much of the disclosure is really hinged on that materiality determination. And in addition to the assessment process, the SEC is also requesting information on the governance structure and of the material climate risks, specifically how management oversees and manages material climate risks, as well as how the board of directors oversight of such material climate risks. Disclosures of targets and goals are also tied to materiality, although the targets and goals disclosures are not tied explicitly to material climate risk. So the targets and goals are whether or not that target or goal is financially material in and of itself. Targets and goals that may be in scope may be external goals, such as those submitted to Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, as well as targets and goals that are internal, if they meet the materiality threshold and are reasonably likely to affect business or the results of operation or financial conditions. If a target or goal is considered material, registrants will need to disclose the following. They'll have to disclose the boundary of the target or goal. That means, looking at emissions from scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 3 emissions within targets and goals do need to be disclosed. Within the boundary, they'd also look at the physical boundary, so which businesses or business units are included within that target. You need to disclose how the target is measured. Are you looking at reductions of CO2e or potentially an intensity reduction? You have to disclose the time horizon for your target or goal and for achieving that target or goal. So if it's a near-term target as compared to a long-term target or potentially a net zero target. You would have to disclose how the registrant intends to meet its target or goal. So what types of levers are you looking at? What actions and decarbonization strategies are you potentially applying to meet your carbon reduction goal? And the registrant will be required to disclose and update each year regarding how it's progressing relative to its target or goal and how such progress has been achieved, including actions it's taken during that year. So if the target or goal is determined to be material, then it's highly likely that scope 3 emissions are in fact required to be disclosed in some way. SBTI requires most non-SMEs targets to be included within scope 3. So a registrant may need to report scope 3 emissions as part of their targets. However, they don't need to report scope 3 emissions within their GHG emission metrics reporting that we'll talk about in a second.
Eric, that's really interesting. I want to jump in quickly here. So complying to the SEC rule, requires, let's say, a subset of disclosures that we typically look at in larger sustainability programs. So let's take SBTI as an example. SEC companies will be expected to report progress against the scope of the material target. And so, I'm just looking at the fact that there will be a difference in disclosure expectations. And typically with SBTI, a company communicating, let's say, achievement of a target, some of that progress towards meeting the goal or achieving the goal might actually fall outside of what the SEC rule deems to be financially material. So yeah, this kind of tension there between the more narrow disclosure requirements of the SEC rule and kind of the larger sustainability disclosure expectations with SBTI and perhaps other jurisdictions is interesting. I'm wondering if you can kind of dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we do see that throughout different sustainability reporting frameworks that the SEC itself has a very narrow, basically a narrow goal of the information it's trying to have registrants present for financial purposes, whereas some of the more broader frameworks ask for more information. So to your point, or your example with SBTI, if we're looking at a client that has a target set through SBTI, the SEC only wants to know their progress and what they're doing related to that target specifically the material portions of that target. So it's a very specific area which the SEC would like information regarding. For SBTI, in addition to that information, you also need to report out on your entire greenhouse gas footprint, even portions that aren't included within your target boundary. And you also need to report annually on other aspects of your reduction strategy that may not be required specifically for the SEC disclosure. That's just one example, but we would also see the same type of limiting amount of information in the SEC disclosure when compared to if an organization is required to report to CSRD or is reporting through the IFRS or IFRS S2 standards. Both of those have a much broader a broader look for information they're looking for as compared to the very specific information that the SEC is requiring. And so related to that, the SEC doesn't define exactly what type of reduction pathways they do want information regarding if you do have a target or goal, but there are specific reduction pathways that the commission does call out and does call out for additional information, which are the use of carbon offsets and or RECs if they are used as a material component to achieve a target or goal. So if you do use an offset, carbon offset, or probably more likely RECs within a target or goal, the commission wants to know what the reduction or removal represented by that REC or offset is. They want to know the source and nature of the instrument. They want to know the location of that project. Mm-hmm. They're requesting that the registry, or they want to understand if that instrument is authenticated through a registry or a different authentication which it's aligned to, and they want to know the cost of the instrument. And the identification of a material use of a REC and or offset would then feed back into the SX financial disclosure items that we discussed earlier. So we are on to our second poll. For our second poll, we're asking which aspects of the non-financial disclosure is looking to be most challenging for your company to prepare for. We're looking for potentially risk identification, scenario analysis, risk monitoring and managing, targets and goals reporting, and or setting up internal controls and governance systems. All right, looks like the polls are closed, and we have a good variety of different areas that the people on the webinar are interested in. All through risk identification, 15%, scenario analysis, looking at 21%, risk monitoring and managing, 10%, 19% on targets and goals reporting, and 35% on setting up internal controls and governance systems, which is very interesting in that that is a really key lead area that most people who are required to report to the SEC rule really need to look at as a long lead time, is setting up those internal controls and governance systems, specifically for the audit procedures, but also having all the controls in place so that you are confident in the information you have to disclose whenever your timeline starts. So going back to what else is required, the final rule does require that certain registrants disclose material scope 1 and 2 emissions. This is only required for large accelerated filers, and accelerated filers are subject to this specific requirement. It's clear it is also clear that a registrant may deem only scope 1 or only scope 2 emissions as material through the SEC's comments. The SEC states that a registrant's scope 1 and or scope 2 emissions may be material because their calculation and disclosure are necessary to allow investors to understand whether those emissions are significant enough to subject the registrant to a transition risk that will or reasonably will be likely to materially impact its business results of operation or financial condition in the short term or long term. So for example, where a registrant faces a material transition risk as a result of a requirement to report its greenhouse gas emissions under either a foreign rule or a state law, or because its emissions are currently reasonably likely to be subject to additional regulatory burdens through increased taxes or financial penalties, the registrant should consider whether those emission metrics are material under the final rules. A registrant's greenhouse gas emissions may also be material if their calculation and disclosure are necessary to enable an investor to understand whether the registrant has made progress toward achieving a target or goal or a transition plan that the registrant is required to disclose under the final rules. Those being the targets and goals and transition plans that we were just discussing. However, neither a regulatory burden or a material transition risk in and of itself does trigger materiality. So what they're basically saying is just because an organization, potentially has to report their greenhouse gas emissions for instance, the California rules, doesn't necessarily mean that means it's material. It still has to meet that materiality threshold. If the registrant is reporting their scope 1 and 2 emissions, they will be required to disaggregate the individual greenhouse gases within reporting, as well as the aggregated CO2e emissions. They will also be required to disclose the methodology applied to completing those calculations. And if a registrant uses RECs as part of their scope 2 emissions, they need to report their scope 2 emissions prior to applying the RECs. So their true scope 2 emission consumption-based emissions prior to the application of any renewable energy credit. In the future, their large accelerated filers and accelerated filers will need to include an attestation reports that cover their emissions. Registrants will initially need to seek limited assurance, with large accelerated filers potentially need to seek reasonable assurance by 2033. I'm going to pass it back over to Bonnie to talk a little bit more about how the SEC climate rule fits into some of the other frameworks.
Great, thank you, Eric. So this slide kind of demonstrates, I think, a little bit of kind of that underlying sentiment that we saw in the poll, with 35% of our participants saying that their greatest need is around setting up those internal controls and governance systems. And what's kind of generating that need is not only the SEC rule, but really just this kind of shifting global regulatory landscape. So let me start at the bottom of our compliance pyramid. We talked a little bit earlier in the webinar about TCFD and the shift around ISSB, and let me go back to that briefly. So ISSB, which again is the International Sustainability Standards Board, was set up in 2021. It was a mandate communicated at COP26 in Glasgow, and really was a culmination of the TCFD voluntary framework serving its role, but in a voluntary space where there still was a kind of lag between consistent and comparable and investor useful data. The ISSB formerly took over the TCFD's oversight role of the TCFD voluntary framework, and the formulation of that TCFD framework into the two main standards, which you'll see there. I call them IFRS S1 and S2. That acronym stands for the International Foundation of Reporting Standards, which is the foundation body that oversees not only the International Sustainability Standards Board, but also the International Accounting Standards Board, which formally informed setting global baselines for financial reporting globally. So that's just to note that this is a significant development and really formalizes the TCFD under kind of a new global foundation that intends to set baselines for different jurisdictions to build from. So just an example of kind of a national or jurisdiction level legislation. The broadest, of course, is Europe's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And the 12 standards that fall under that are the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. The standard focused on climate is aligned to IFRS S2 and TCFD, and it's notable that this legislation is markedly different from the SEC climate rule in that it applies to both public companies and private companies. It also encompasses topics that span beyond climate risk and cover broad social, environmental, and governance topics. So broader legislation here, and it is estimated, by the way, that about 3,700 companies are affected by both the EU CSRD and the SEC rule. So market regulations, the US SEC climate rule is an example of this. The UK was the first of the G7 countries to finalize their climate financial related risk rule. And it's notable that all G7 countries incorporate all four principles of TCFD and IFRS S2 into rulemaking. What that basically means is there's commonality in principles, in definitions, in approaches that allow for interoperability for meeting and reporting under multiple jurisdictions. So next we have regional laws. The newest one and the most impactful one on the block is California's SB 261 and SB 253. We're going to focus on SB 261 here today, just because this is the law that essentially references meeting compliance through following the IFRS S2 standard or the voluntary TCFD framework. By the way, 253 is really around GHG emissions accounting and has some overlap on the SEC rule around scope 1 and 2, although I'll just note quickly that SB 253 does include scope 3 emissions as well. So what we're seeing here is that the finalization of the IFRS S2, S1 and S2 standards has really kind of spurred and quickened the pace of global regulation setting, and And so in a sense, it has, I know for companies, it feels like there's an increased burden on reporting. The silver lining to this is that everything that you see here on the screen has commonality in those standards. The SEC rule, as Eric mentioned today, deviates from these standards in a number of different areas, and I would just note that it probably is the one that deviates the most from what you're seeing here on the screen. And then notably, not seen here, but CDP is shifting this year to fully align their climate disclosure questionnaire fully to the IFRS S2 standard. So, so all of this is just to say that there's a common foundation to kind of support the system development and the setting of kind of those internal capacities and controls. So let's look quickly here at a preparation timeline. So this is essentially very similar to the slide we showed earlier in the webinar, and this is just to support some planning and some really thinking about when to start and what needs to be done. Certainly for the large accelerated filers, most of these companies have been tracking to the proposed rule and have been anticipating meeting compliance. A few things to note here, just simply, do not rely on the stay to delay your compliance timeline at this point in time. And there's certainly quite a bit of preparation that can be done this year in 2024 so that your reporting specifically around climate-related risk, governance, climate targets, and other supplemental information can be, let's say, practiced and really kind of just those learnings and mistakes kind of corrected and incorporated into your processes so that once that fiscal year 2025 timeframe comes around, there's just an increased confidence in the system and reporting. Timelines are a little bit later for other companies. We do typically suggest that companies get started ideally 2 years prior to the timeline. So just kind of practicing what you need to do 2 years ahead of time, 1 year at minimum. So again, for companies that are going to be subject to assurance requirements, you want to ensure that the topics that are falling under that assurance requirement are going to be able to successfully complete the assurance process prior to your compliance deadline, so that you are not only meeting the regulatory expectation that you will achieve limited assurance by that date, but that you can incorporate and prepare for any mistakes that that we do see come up in those processes and have those resolved well in advance. So in terms of those preparation steps that you'll want to be taking 1 to 2 years in advance of compliance, we've just broken these down by themes for you. And as suggested in the poll, governance is kind of first on the list. So, this is really looking at capacity development, defining roles and responsibilities, even a little bit of kind of internal education around the intent of this law and how it fits into finance and ERM systems, whereas like your internal sustainability programs might have a little bit more familiarity with these themes. There's some space to kind of socialize and educate, even up to the board. Within this is, the financial materiality assessment and applying that in the different aspects as Eric kind of touched on in the webinar. Next, climate risk assessment. Again, you really want to carry out a robust process. You're going to need to include scenario analysis in that. GHG emission measurement, practicing on that scope 1 and 2 emission inventory if you have not done that yet. And then of course, considering how scope 3 is related to targets and goals reporting under the rule. disclosure preparedness, this kind of gets back to, understanding those gaps between the different standards and rules that your company may be subject to, and really moving towards an integrated reporting format, particularly around those non-financial disclosures. And again, those support systems that are needed both on the governance aspect, but also the data and the information that flows into the disclosures. And then there's kind of assurance preparedness. So, that falls under those two categories: your financial audits, the ICFR process, and then the GHG and non-financial disclosure verification and assurance process. And, maybe I'll just note from this slide, SCS Consulting Services, can help with governance, climate risk, GHG emission measurement, disclosure, and even assurance preparedness. However, carrying out the non-financial in GHG verification and reporting assurance is done on SCS Global Services side, which is our sister company. So here at SCS, we're here to help you as you're kind of looking at the timeframes in advance of your compliance effective date and the steps that you may need to take in order to ensure you're ready for complying to the climate rule from the SEC and other relevant regulations and legislation that you might fall under as well. So that's it. We've actually run over just a little bit, so I thank everybody for staying on the webinar till it's to its end, and we'll just leave you with our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us directly. We'll be looking at any questions that have been entered into the GoToWebinar portal. If you have a question and you have not yet entered it, please do so before you sign off. And I'll just leave by making a plug really quickly. We've got 2 other webinars that are part of our spring series. Next, on May 15th, we'll be hosting a webinar on CDP, and we'll be discussing the many transformations that CDP is implementing this year, one of which is the full alignment between CDP climate questions and the IFRS S2 standard that we briefly mentioned today. The third webinar on June 18th is actually going to be a great pairing to this webinar. It'll take a deeper dive into climate risk assessment and scenario analysis. And you will be invited to sign up for these webinars in the email that you will send as a follow-up to this webinar. It will include a link to the recording and links to sign up to the forthcoming webinars in the series. I want to thank you one last time for joining us today, and we hope to see you again for a future webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.